Thanks, Eric. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Steve Grove here, Commissioner of Deed, and I'm joined today by Orion Casal, our Labor Market Information Director. And this is a bit of an experiment. We wanted to try to do a more transparent, more open, more engaging way to talk every month with reporters who cover the state of our economy here in Minnesota. And we know that we're in an unprecedented period of time as it relates to the challenges our economy faces. Clearly, we're in a recession for which the likes of which we've never really seen before. And so in that spirit, wanted to just put a bit more care and attention into these monthly job numbers and the updates that we share, and just take your questions live and get a chance to hear what's on your minds. And of course, if there are deeper dives into the data that we can't answer here, we can always follow up, but wanted to take this moment just as these numbers have come out to have a conversation. So thanks for joining us. We're going to offer a couple of thoughts up top. Hopefully most of you have had a chance to see the numbers. They've been published now at mn.gov/deed. So we'll be brief on kind of highlighting some of the major trends that we saw coming out of the report this month, and then turn to your questions as soon as possible. So I think, the first top line thought to share here is that we do continue to see some steady growth in Minnesota. That growth is uneven across industries and occupations, and it has continued to be slower than that initial bounce back we saw in the middle of summer. As you saw from the report, about 40,500 payroll jobs added in August. That's up about 1.5% from July, which is a slightly better uptick than we saw for the month before. The nation as a whole added about 1.37 million jobs in August, up about 1% from July. So we were just slightly above the nation in terms of job growth, which is a good trend. In previous months, we had been slightly behind the nation in job growth. And so we'll hope that that continues. When you break it down by industry, one of the major seasonally adjusted gains came from the government industry. About 11,000 jobs came from that sector, and we think part of that was a lot of the census hiring that's been taken by the federal government to complete the census in our state. And then some of the service industries continue to come back slightly. So leisure and hospitality was up 7,800 jobs, accommodation and food services, and education and health services was up about 7,100 jobs. These, of course, are industries that saw a huge dip as Minnesota and the country slowed the economy down to prevent the spread of COVID. And that bounce back continues, of course, not at the rate that would even approach fully replacing that job loss, but we did see some more bounce backs in those industries. Only one super sector in this month actually lost jobs on a seasonally adjusted basis over the month, and that was financial activities, and it was just 0.1%, about 100 jobs down. So it was good growth across every super sector after a tough spring and summer. But of course, over the year, every super sector has lost jobs, and that's true both in Minnesota and in the country. We have shed about 219,000 payroll jobs since the start of this year. That's down about 7.3% compared to this time last year, and the U.S. job loss is about 7% over the year. So we're a little bit greater pace in terms of job loss than the nation, but that gap has continued to decrease month over month, which is a good thing. In terms of the super sectors that have showed some strength in Minnesota, kind of compared to the rest of the country, there's three main ones that we've seen kind of positive trend lines comparatively for Minnesota. The first is trade, transportation, and utilities. In particular, retail trade has done better in Minnesota. It's one of the only two component sectors that has made a full rebound in jobs. So online retailers, that's really growing, obviously. Minnesota obviously has a very strong retail headquarters environment, and it is an industry in which we've actually had jobs bounce back almost completely, in fact, fully from where they were before the pandemic. Same is true for professional and business services in terms of that bounce back, not as complete as retail, but temp help is actually doing a lot better in Minnesota compared to other states, which is really interesting as folks rely on temporary help to fill jobs that they may have some uncertainty around in terms of longer term viability or trajectory. And then food production was another area where we've just seen a huge bounce back. We're up here again year over year at 1.1% as a component sector of our economy. More folks are eating at home. We've seen a huge amount of food exports taking place. You saw that in our export report last week. So that's another area that has bounced back. Turning to our unemployment rate for a moment, we are at 7.4% in August. That's down from 7.7% in July. Of course, we're at a historic high in May at 9.9%. So trend line continues downward, but not quite at the clip that we had seen before. The national unemployment rate we saw last week is at 8.4%, so we're still about a point under the nation. The nation's unemployment rate came down considerably in August compared to the month before, and of course it peaked at 14.7% back in April. So while some jobs are coming back, they're just not coming back at the same level for all occupations, of course, and that means that a lot of workers in Minnesota have to look at changing career paths, finding new in-demand jobs. Now we're focused a lot on highlighting some of the in-demand industries for hiring that are moving and that are growing. And we know that for many workers, that's a difficult thing to consider shifting your role from a job you had before the pandemic to after. But it's just been a big focus of ours through our career force efforts and through our partners in workforce to focus there. I think it's worth highlighting, of course, that people of color in Minnesota continue to experience much higher levels of unemployment compared to the rest of the population. We've begun for the first time this year highlighting in this monthly report the 6-month rolling averages for various demographic groups in the state from March to August. And as you saw in today's release, 16.3% of Black Minnesotans, 9.7% of Hispanic or Latino Minnesotans, and about 6.7% of white Minnesotans are unemployed. So those disparities are significant, more than double for Black Minnesotans than for white Minnesotans. We know this pandemic has had an uneven effect on various demographic groups. When you look at Black Minnesotans in particular, a high percentage of Black Minnesota labor force is employed in the leisure and hospitality industry. And that's just an industry that is really the #1 most stressed industry in the state. And so that's going to affect our Black Minnesotans in the labor force. So we continue to focus on disproportionately funneling our efforts and job recovery focus on the populations that need it most. And then the last thing we want to highlight before going to questions is just we were glad to see that Minnesota's nationally recognized strong work ethic continues to show through. We've seen our labor force participation rate always be at or around 70%. That means essentially people that are in the labor market and ready to work or are working. And that number this month is at 69.8%. It had fallen to 69.3% in July, and it was 70.2% before this all began. So we've remained really high. I think we're one of the top 1 or 2 in the country on labor force participation. The national rate is 61.7%. And so we track this number closely because we want to determine are people giving up on the labor market based on some of the conditions that are out there. And this data shows us that is not the case yet. We're really still right in that ballpark of where we were near 70% when the start of this pandemic hit. So with that, Oriana and I are here to answer your questions, and we look forward to hearing what you'd like to dig into more deeply. Looks like Brian, you did a chat here, so why don't you go first?
Hey, Commissioner, can you hear me?
Yeah. Hey, Brian.
I was wondering if you've gotten any more updated information as to how long the $300 add-on payment is going to last. I know that you were looking at the middle of the month as a potential dry-up window. Is it lasting longer, shorter? Where is it at?
We believe it's done. We have now paid out the full 6 weeks of lost wages assistance. We applied for a 7th week just to have that application in with FEMA, but what they have told us is that 6 weeks is going to be the amount that they think that balance in the disaster relief fund has for every state. That could change. You never know. Obviously, they're managing this across 50 different states and 50 different timelines for benefits, but they're pretty clear line to us is that that's done. So put that in the context, that means if you qualified for every one of those 6 weeks, you got an additional $1,800 from the federal government, which would be equivalent to about, well, exactly 3 weeks of that CARES Act $600 top off that had been there before. So we wish there was more. We got out as quickly as we could. We'll, of course, monitor for more, but for now, it looks like we've capped at that 6 week mark.
So when was the last payout week?
So the last payout week would have been the week that ended. I have to go and look. I think it was the week that ended September 6th, if I remember. I have to get my calendar out, but it started on August 25th. So if you do the math from August 25th, it's going to be early September, roughly. And those payments have all now been processed. So we expect by the end of this week, essentially by the end of tomorrow, everyone will have that money in their bank account and ready to go. I think it is September 6th, by the way. That was just got a text from my team that it was September 6th.
And so as far as we know, there's no other programs that are still out there to
No.
tap into.
No, and it's an important question. Obviously you've seen conversations in Washington with, Representative Phillips and others in the Problem Solvers Caucus trying to find a middle path here and produce something. But the federal government has set a cap at the amount of money they wanted to pull from the disaster relief fund, so that they retained at least $25 million in it for hurricanes and the like. And I think they're serious about that. And so at this time, we're moving forward as if there's no such future benefit coming.
And I see
Kavita,
we have
looks like.
Kavita
Oh, sorry,
has her
Brian.
hand
Did you have a follow up? Great.
Sorry, I said that.
Kavita, looks like you raised your hand.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah. Hey, how are you?
Good. Was wondering if you have any thoughts about the unemployment rate still being at 7.7 or 7.4. It didn't fall that much from the month before. So I guess, are you surprised or, troubled by that? I mean, and at the same time, it seems like the job growth numbers shows a little bit more strength. So we kind of saw two different, on the one hand, the unemployment rate kind of slowed. It felt like the fall, but the job growth increased at higher rates. I guess, how do you make sense of those two? And and what are your thoughts on that unemployment rate not falling more?
Yeah, we certainly hoped it would drop by more. I think people tend to over-index unemployment rate as the sort of one and only sign of how the economy is doing, and it certainly isn't. But I'm going to turn it over to Orion, because there were some issues around sample size with the unemployment rate that had always had us kind of scratching our heads a little bit in terms of if it was as accurate as we might think it is. So Orion, do you want to give a little bit more detail on that?
Sure, absolutely. Actually, the response rate went up this month in August. So it had dropped down to 76.1%, and it was up to 80.7%. The response rate is obviously important because we have a very small sample in Minnesota, and it's a household survey. So the first time you roll into the survey, you are actually, someone comes to your house, explains the questions to you, does a much more in-depth question answer. And that's pulling the response rate. That's all happening over the phone, I should say. That's pulling the response rate down. But again, the response rate was up in August. It had dropped to 76.1% during this period. More typical response rate in Minnesota is close to 90%. So with that introduces some data quality issues. The fact that employment fell so quickly, it was very difficult for the methods that the BLS uses to calculate the unemployment rate to really get a good handle on the seasonal adjustment. That's being worked out. So actually, I think that where we are in August is probably a pretty good indication of unemployment in Minnesota at this.
Thanks, Kavita. Any other questions?
And then I guess just to follow up on that, what do you think is still depressing the job recovery? Obviously there's still some business restrictions on restaurants and hotels, but what else are you seeing? What are you hearing from employers and from folks in the state about about the job recovery?
Yeah. Well, I think, as we all know, this recession is different, as every recession is different in terms of who it's affected. And we know the service industry in particular has been harder hit than, say, goods producing firms that were at the center of, I think, the 2009 Great Recession and the job loss there. I think that a big part of this is consumer confidence. When you look at the number of consumers that want to go out to a restaurant, for example, one of the hardest industries, it's like 35% nationally. So if 2/3 of the country doesn't believe it's safe to go to a restaurant, that's going to affect revenues regardless of any state's approach to restrictions or capacity limits or what have you. So I think, we just haven't gotten the virus under control really anywhere in the country to the extent that consumers are going to be confident going out and do the things they usually do. And so we want to encourage people to do to go out and spend money, to go out and engage in the economy. Of course, wearing a mask and being safe and being careful. But it's a time when I think people are necessarily kind of cautious. And I think for us, heading into the winter, when we know the weather is going to change dynamics around consumer behavior, indoor venues become, obviously more necessary in Minnesota and things of that nature. We're headed for, I think, some more challenging times there. But that's why safety is so important, and why where the health conditions, how the health conditions improve dictates so much of where consumers will gain in their confidence to get out there and engage more safely and spend money, and that of course will help our economy. So Theo Keith.
And I would just add that it's not
sure,
only in, I would say only in leisure and hospitality and arts and entertainment, but it's also in things like healthcare. Dentist offices are still way down. Ambulatory care is still way down. People are choosing to delay procedures and visits. And so, it does affect a lot of different industries.
Theo, let's go to you.
Hi, Commissioner, can you hear me?
I can, yeah, loud and clear.
Okay, sure. We're now 6 months since things really hit the fan here in this pandemic, and the unemployment rate went up and people lost their jobs. My understanding is Minnesota has a 26-week cap on unemployment benefits. And that would mean that we're about at that. Any talk of extending that? Can you walk us through what happens when you reach the 26?
No, it's a great question, Theo, and it's hard to believe, hasn't it, that it's been 6 months since this all began. Luckily, we have a provision in our statutes that if unemployment is above 6.6%, then we indefinitely extend unemployment insurance benefits beyond the typical caps of 26 or 13 weeks. And so you had that extension come from the federal government, which is great. They paid for that. So that 13-week plus up was not out of our trust fund, but came from the federal government. But given our unemployment rate is still so high, we are not forced to start dropping people off the system based on that 26 weeks timeline. So we'll see where the unemployment rate goes, but thankfully, because of that trigger, we've been able to continue to deliver benefits even for those whose benefits would have otherwise expired.
So basically, those people who are unemployed for longer than 26 weeks are covered unless the unemployment rate was to fall to 6.5%.
Yep.
Okay, got it. And then just one other question, just kind of a broader picture question. By my reading of this sort of slowdown in growth over the last couple of months, it could take on this pace up to a year to get back to where we were. Is that your reading of this too?
If we were back where we are at a year from now, I think we'd all be pretty happy about that. I think that's probably a more optimistic projection than you're going to hear most economists share. And Oriana can go into some of the projections that the team has done. But I think you're looking at a longer recovery for that, I think, in most parts of the country. I don't know, Oriana, if you want to go into some of the IHS thinking on this, but a year would be fast.
Yeah, I think the more typical thought there is that full recovery will happen sometime in 2022. And that's a national forecast. And we in Minnesota are fairly closely following that trend so far.
It's hard to feel because so much depends on, when does a vaccine hit? Can we get uncontrolled spread down? And so there's just a lot of unknowns, to be honest, and we all know that. But I think a couple of years is probably more in the neighborhood, as Oriana said.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Hey, Kavita.
Hi. I was just curious, and I was just kind of reading some national stories about some concerns about a double dip recession. Are you guys seeing any signs that like worry you about, potentially things getting worse in this fall?
Orion should answer this too. I think the unknown with the fall has to do with does the twin pandemic of flu exacerbate where we're at with COVID? Can we get things under control such that in seasonally affected economies like ours, we don't lose a lot of business that, might otherwise be able to transition to indoors, because indoors, of course, is where the virus spreads more rapidly. So, and I think the other major variable here, of course, everyone's tracking is the return to school and what effect does that have on the trajectory. So there are just, I think in this period kind of transitioning into the colder weather, there's some new variables entering into the picture from a health perspective that are significant enough such that I don't think I want to predict whether we're going to double dip or not. The recovery has been good. I mean, it's been good to see job growth slowly coming back, not at the pace that it did in that initial bounce, but I don't know, Oriana, if you want to add anything to that in terms of outlook.
Yeah, Minnesota has one of the most seasonal economies in the country, and obviously the COVID pandemic is going to only make that more dramatic because people's leisure and hospitality spending is going to be so much impacted, so much more impacted in the winter than it is in the summer. So I think we have to hope that the pandemic and spread really stays under control so that people feel comfortable going out.
I see that M. Kamal, and I'm sorry, M, if I don't know your first name, but the question here is a good one, which is how is Minnesota unemployment rate compared to neighboring states such as Iowa? So we get the state-by-state comparisons data tomorrow morning, so we'll know more then on that data for August. But for July, we were the 18th lowest unemployment rate in the nation. South Dakota was the 5th lowest at 6.3%. Iowa was the 7th lowest at 6.6%. North Dakota was at 6.6% as well, and Wisconsin was at 7%. So we were slightly higher than some of our neighboring states in the last report, though as a nation we were in the top third overall at 7.7%.
And I did just want to cut in and let you know that we are at just under 5 minutes left in today's press conference. So if you want to add closing thoughts.
Great. Well, sure. Maybe we'll pause just for another moment if there's any other questions from our reporters. Any other questions from the reporters here? Great. Well, thanks for joining us, everybody. We really appreciate the chance to engage on this. We want to continue to do these every month as a way to be transparent, not only to the press, of course, but also to the public in Minnesota who has the opportunity to watch these over live stream and just hear a little bit more about the context of our economy. We know we're in the middle of a very difficult time, and having the opportunity to share with you a little bit more the context behind the numbers and answer the most pressing questions you have is just a big priority of ours. So thanks for joining us, and please follow up individually if you have any other specific questions that we weren't able to get to on the call. Thanks, everybody.
And I have some slides that I could project up if people want to stay on for a couple more minutes if you're interested in some graphics of the data. So this slide just walks through the seasonally adjusted and unadjusted employment industry employment numbers, kind of a recap of what the commissioner has already provided to you. This is a recap of the unemployment statistics. This is a visual of the unemployment rate Minnesota compared to the US over a 1-year period. As you can see, we continue the trend, but the U.S. had a sharper increase and is having a sharper decline as well. This is a visual of the seasonally adjusted employment by industry data. So as you can see, U.S. compared to Minnesota, Minnesota had growth across all industries except for financial activities, and that was in the finance and insurance component. And this is over the year change, Minnesota compared to the US. And as you can see, every industry, every major industry shows decline. There are a couple of bright spots here, retail trade and actually federal government, which is seasonal census hiring at the moment. I think we can send this slide deck out to anyone who's interested. And I'm happy to take questions.
Well, seeing as we doesn't appear we have any questions and we are at time, I think we'll call it there. Thanks everyone for participating. Thanks for your help. Yeah, let me know if you want a copy of that slide deck. I can send it to you, or let Rita know, and we can send it to you as well. Yes, thank you everybody. And all right, and I'm going to go ahead and